The Yugoslav tragedy. Decades of terror. Neighbors become deadly enemies. Millions lose their homes. More than 100,000 people die. The uninhibited cruelty in the southeast of Europe unsettles the world.
Violence was used to send messages. Murder, rape, all of this was to say, if you stay, this is what will happen to you.
The ideological incendiaries are Tudjman and Milosevic. Two ruthless nationalists make the Balkan powder keg explode.
Milosevic just wanted power and wanted influence. Tudjman wanted to break up Yugoslavia, wanted to create a greater Croatia. He actually believed all this nationalism.
The war drags the entire country into an abyss. Europe and the United States watch helplessly.
They didn't clearly see the interest in getting involved and arresting the bloodshed.
Why did the peoples of Yugoslavia become sworn enemies? What blame lies with Europe and the USA? It's a lesson about the failure of politics. Zagreb, the 13th of May, 1990. Yugoslavia has been simmering for a long time, but today the tensions erupt in violence. Croatian and Serbian football fans attack each other. At the time, Vjekoslav Skriniar plays for Zagreb. The Yugoslav police are especially brutal toward the Croatian fans.
It was an aggression against us, the resistance that we Croats had tried to separate from Yugoslavia.
It is a taste of what is to come. At the time, Yugoslavia is made up of 6 constituent republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. The Serbs are the largest ethnic group. More than a third of all Serbs live outside the constituent Serbian Republic.
Yugoslavia had been the first state in which all Serbs were united in a state structure. That means that with the imminent collapse of Yugoslavia, the question for the Serbs was, what will happen to the Serbian nation after Yugoslavia's downfall?
In Belgrade, Slobodan Milosevic bets on violence. Since 1987, he is the Republic of Serbia's strongman. His dream? Become as mighty as Tito once was. Slobodan Milosevic was considered a loner. He made a career with the communists as a party official. After Tito's death, Milosevic became more and more of a heated political agitator.
He saw the power of national expression, and he saw what he could do. I don't think at the beginning he was a nationalist and that he believed in it.
Milosevic wants to stop Yugoslavia's collapse, hopes for power over the entire country. But his nationalist propaganda has the opposite result. In January 1990, a special party convention of the communists in Belgrade falls apart. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Slovenians and the Croats want out of the communist system. When all of their reform proposals are rejected, the Slovenian delegates leave the hall.
The idea was greater independence, the idea that they could control their own future, that they could determine their own economic life, and that they could move towards a liberal market, European Union type version of the world.
New parties emerge in the Yugoslav constituent republics. In the spring of 1990, Slovenia and Croatia hold their first free elections since World War II. Milan Kucan wins in Slovenia. The ex-communist runs as an independent candidate. He stands for economic reforms. In Zagreb, the winner is Franja Tudjman. Tudjman was one of Tito's partisans during World War II. He then rose to Yugoslav army general. Later, Tudjman also developed into a fanatic nationalist and was imprisoned multiple times. With Tito's death, he returned to politics. As Tudjman sees it, the Croats live under Serbian dominance, from which they have to free themselves. He wants a strong, independent Croatia. His model for that is the independent Croatia of 1941, Hitler's puppet state, where the so-called Ustasha ruled.
Everywhere you went in Croatia, once Tudjman was in power, you saw the U of the Ustasha. It was a festival of extreme Croatian nationalism, and nobody could doubt what the intentions of Tudjman were.
45 years after World War II, Tudjman makes Croatian nationalism respectable again. He downgrades the Serbs in Croatia to a minority and massively limits their rights.
This stoked fears and frustrations, and many thought of 1941 and the Ustasha state, when more than 200,000 Serbs were murdered and many deported or locked up in camps. The spirits of history kind of came up again.
Tudjman's nationalist politics add further fuel to the flame. The new president of the Constituent Republic minimizes the crimes of the Ustasha, lowering the tally of Serbian victims, and reinstates fascist symbols from 1941.
Whether it was the Šachovnica, the checkerboard, which in many ways to Serbs was like the swastika was in Germany. It was a symbol of a state of nationalism, a state where they suffered during World War II, where hundreds of thousands of Serbs were killed.
Franja Tudjman and Slobodan Milosevic become fierce opponents. Both of them, the Croat and the Serb, bundle nationalist slogans and stoke deep old resentments.
They used state television in order to generate fear. Fear of an Ustasha revival, fear of a Chetnik Serbian nationalist revival. They were generating hysteria, and they did it through mass rallies as well as through the mass media.
In the crosshairs of propaganda, the old railway town Knin. Mainly Serbs live here on Croatian land. In August 1990, thousands protest against the Croatian government. Tudjman wants to fire all Serbian policemen in Knin and replace them with Croats. That reminds many here of World War II.
Behind the scenes, these people were being supported by Belgrade, by Milosevic, and their fears were being exploited by Serbia, saying, you won't be safe here, you can't live in an independent Croatia.
Drago Kovacevic still remembers the fear that the Serbian communities were rife with at the time.
The fear of 1941 resurfaced for many when the Serbs experienced a genocide, a slaughter. That fear got imprinted in their memory and passed on from generation to generation. And now it had been brought back to the surface on purpose.
In mid-August, Serbs build roadblocks around the enclaves in which mostly Serbs live. A purely protective measure as the Serbs see it, the Croats call it terror. Because in the middle of tourist season, the barriers block access to the holiday destinations of the Adriatic.
There weren't only barricades on the streets. The biggest ones were in their minds. They were a welcome sign for extremists on both sides to take even more radical action. It led to battle 100%.
Serbian nationalists want to split off the settlement areas around Knin from Croatia and create an autonomous Serbian area in the southwest, called the Krajina. The Croatian Ministry of the Interior sends helicopters with special forces units to Knin. Fighter jets from Belgrade intercept the helicopters and force them to land. A first showdown. Yugoslavia is on the brink of civil war.
It isn't a war yet. There is no shooting yet, no casualties, but there is a state of emergency.
In the spring of 1991, tensions escalate. The first skirmishes happen in Serbian-populated areas, the Krajina and eastern Slavonia, with casualties on both sides. For the Yugoslav central government in Belgrade, the time has come to bring the People's Army out of the barracks. The army sees its mission as defending the Yugoslav state and resolving internal conflicts.
The army tried to create buffer zones. They occupied barracks and tried to secure weapons depots so the conflict wouldn't escalate further.
A peaceful solution to the dispute between the constituent republics doesn't seem possible. Belgrade wants to preserve the Serbian-dominant federal state. Slovenia and Croatia want autonomy. On the 25th of June, 1991, the Croats and the Slovenians declare their independence. The significance of this move is greatly underestimated in Europe.
The European community had just adopted the idea of a common foreign policy. It was a bright new world. We were heading towards the prospect of the European Union. The Yugoslav conflict and crisis was a blemish on that world, but it seemed that they should be able to solve this silly little problem.
Yugoslav tanks rolled towards Slovenia's borders on the 26th of June. A last attempt to hold Yugoslavia together by force. But the Slovenians are ready. The troops of the so-called territorial defense are under Slovenian control. They capture units of the Yugoslav People's Army and hold them in their barracks. After only 10 days, Belgrade gives in.
It was a symbolic attempt to keep Yugoslavia together, but that was never really in the plans to retain Slovenia.
The war in Slovenia ends so quickly because hardly any Serbs lived there.
In that sense, Slovenia was fine because the Serbs had no territorial claims there and no Serb areas that they wanted to secure, so to say.
At this point, Slobodan Milosevic makes a choice. If the Serbian people can no longer live together in Greater Yugoslavia, then they should have a larger Serbian state, including all Serbian settlements. A third of all Serbians live outside the constituent Republic of Serbia. Almost 1.4 million in Bosnia-Herzegovina and more than 500,000 in Croatia. The first step in Milosevic's plan: split off the Serbian territories from Croatia and displace all non-Serbs, supported by units of the Yugoslav army.
The Yugoslavian People's Army practically disintegrated in 1991. That means that the Slovenians, Croats and Bosnians also left this People's Army, and what was left were those who were for Yugoslavia, or in other words, who were for a large, strong Serbia.
The Bosnian Serb Ratko Mladic is the commander in charge of military operations in Krajina.
službi otadžbine Socijalističke federativne republike Jugoslavije sa mojim drugovima, starešinama i svih iz redova svih naroda i narodnosti I sa svojim vojnicima.
His neutrality is a facade. Mladic only fights for Serbian interests. Ratko Mladic was 2 years old when his father was murdered by Croatian nationalists. This is probably one of the reasons why, as a colonel in the Yugoslavian People's Army, he is ruthless in his actions against the Croatian population. He's considered an ice-cold strategist. The first Croatian village that Mladic targets in August 1991 is Kijevo. He field tests his strategy there, and from then on, it's always the same. The army advances with heavy weapons, pushing the population to flee. Anyone who stays is murdered by the invading fighters.
One of the roles of the paramilitary forces is to do those things that others will not do, in a sense, to do the dirty work. Often they're recruited prisoners who've been let out of jail, given the offer of a deal, stay in jail or come out and do this kind of work.
People who had already slipped into the lower classes in the 1980s now see an opportunity to enrich themselves personally or to live out their resentments.
Paramilitaries like the infamous Scorpioni burn down houses, massacre, destroy churches and cemeteries. The Serbs call this ethnic cleansing.
This is about making the survival of an ethnic religious group in a particular area impossible.
By the end of August, Serb fighters with military support from Belgrade have brought the entire Knin region under their control. Meanwhile, Croatian President Tudjman calls on the European community to intervene, but they disagree on how to assess the conflict.
At that time, the outbreak of conflict was portrayed by our media as a conflict in which poor Croatia rightfully defended itself against these invaders and aggressors from Serbia. In Paris, they saw a completely different war. There, a conflict was presented in which the good soldiers of Yugoslavia tried to stop the disintegration of Yugoslavia while suffering considerable losses.
This is partly due to historical ties. In the First World War, the Serbs fought on the side of the English, French, and Russians, while the Croats, as citizens of Austria-Hungary, fought alongside the Germans.
The most important reason for European inability to act in the face of the Yugoslav crisis was different perceptions and interests. The states that had minorities within their own borders, like the French, the Spanish, the Greeks, were opposed to Yugoslavia dissolving and the idea that populations could invoke the right of self-determination and form their own states. They feared a precedent.
In September 1991, the European community invited the parties to a peace conference in The Hague.
The fighting must stop.
There's no agreement in sight.
Hrvatski je narod, jedan od najstarijih povijesnih naroda Europe, koji je unatoč tragici svog geopolitičkog položaja uspio očuvati kontinuitet svoje državnosti.
The points of view are far apart. Both sides see themselves as victims.
Installing of totalitarian chauvinist regime in Croatia directly violated human rights, peace, and an overall democratic development in Yugoslavia.
The European community is proving powerless to prevent the beginning of bloodshed on European soil.
There was the German reunification, there was the Iraq War, there was Maastricht, European unification. These were all problems with which Europe was fully occupied. Yugoslavia was a lower priority.
Even world powers stay out of it. In Moscow, the newly elected President Yeltsin is struggling with the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The USA have just been through a war in Iraq and see the Yugoslavian crisis as a European problem for the time being.
For the United States, they didn't clearly see the interest in getting involved and arresting the bloodshed. It wasn't worth risking, in the United States' eye, bloodshed or any kind of American lives to stop the war in Yugoslavia.
Vukovar, a small Croatian town on the Danube. It sits in the region of eastern Slavonia, directly on the border with Serbia. This is where the bloodiest battle of the Croatian War began on the 14th of September, 1991. The situation around Vukovar has been tense for weeks. The Croats expect an attack. But the defenders of Vukovar are helpless against the powerful Yugoslav People's Army. Belgrade is sending 30,000 soldiers and paramilitaries. On the Croatian side, there are only 3,000 men. The city is at the mercy of the Yugoslav army. Up to 8,000 grenades hit Vukovar daily. Stjepan Vidakovic was a volunteer who took command in his district of Lusak. Even today, he still doesn't understand how Serbs and Croats could kill each other.
Before the war, the coexistence between Croats and Serbs was excellent. We worked together, hung out, played football together. Everything. There was no problem at all.
After a few weeks, large sections of Vukovar lie in ruins. On the 2nd of November, 1991, Serbian fighters attacked Stjepan Vidakovic's district. This house served as a base for his men. Stjepan walks through the very halls where he was injured by a grenade.
And then the roof flew away. I stood next to the wall and I felt a blow here. And then I realized I was bleeding.
There's grenade shrapnel in his arm. Stjepan has to go to the hospital. His brother drives him there. The rest of the family stays behind.
I didn't want them to come with me. Way too dangerous. I said I'd come back quickly.
On the way to the hospital, their car comes under fire.
They shot with machine guns. And then the first tire was blown. My brother wanted to change the tire. I said, they'll shoot us. And then another tire blew. We drove to the hospital on rims.
While Stjepan Vidakovic is treated in the hospital of Vukovar, Serbian units storm his district and murder all who are still there. 9 of his family members are shot that day. Among them were his wife and son. Their remains are only found years later in a mass grave. 3 family members are still missing today.
I'm not angry with anybody. I don't hate anybody. It is unnecessary, but no one was convicted, and no one knows anything. No one has seen anything. No one was there. All innocent. Aliens just came down and killed people.
It was such a brutal and senseless shelling of a very beautiful Danubian town that it meant the Serbs were never going to recover their international standing, and nobody really wanted to be seen as supporting the Serbs.
At Germany's insistence, the European community agrees in mid-December to recognize Slovenia and Croatia as independent states.
Germany had just been reunited and insisted on the people's right to self-determination. But the Serbs said, we also have that right, and if the Serbian people want to live together in one state, then it should be allowed to do so.
In January 1992, the UN manages to negotiate a ceasefire with Slobodan Milosevic. When the military conflict in Croatia is frozen, Slobodan Milosevic has already achieved his goals. 1/3 of the country is under Serbian control.
In one sense, the ceasefire was the beginning of the end of the war in Croatia, but it was the beginning of the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so it was, I think, under the circumstances, probably the only thing that the United Nations could do.
Bosnia-Herzegovina, a microcosm of Yugoslavia. Catholic Croats, Bosnian Muslims, and Orthodox Serbs live here. But after Slovenia and Croatia leave Yugoslavia, Bosnian Croats and Muslims fear Serbian dominance.
The memories of the Second World War were also reawakened when Serbian nationalists slaughtered and expelled thousands of Muslims and Croats. And there was a very real fear that such slaughters could happen again.
The man chosen to lead Bosnia-Herzegovina into independence is Alija Izetbegović. He has been president of the Bosnian Constituent Republic since 1990. As a young Muslim activist, Alija Izetbegović wrote essays about political Islam. Under Tito, he was considered a dissident and was imprisoned twice. The career lawyer only found his way into politics later in life. His goal now is to preserve Bosnia-Herzegovina as a small multi-ethnic state. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, Muslims have lived alongside Christians and Jews for centuries, a legacy from Ottoman times. Bosnian Muslims call themselves Bosniaks. The Bosnian Serbs, led by Radovan Karadzic, want to remain part of Yugoslavia. They make up about 1/3 of the Bosnian population and fight bitterly against Bosnia's independence.
If it happened, then we would have absolutely uncontrolled processes in Bosnia and Herzegovina with terrible ethnical and religious war.
Radovan Karadzic came to Sarajevo as a teenager. He studied medicine, became a psychiatrist, but identifies as a poet above all. Later, he entered politics and became leader of the Bosnian Serbs.
Karadzic was obsessed with creating a Serbian state in which all Serbs would live together and from which all non-Serbs would have to disappear, especially the Bosnian Muslims, whom he regarded as the original enemy of the Serbian people, as something foreign and inferior.
In the summer of 1991, when war breaks out in Croatia, hundreds of people take to the streets in Sarajevo to demonstrate for peace. The highlight of the movement is a concert in the 1984 Olympic Hall, a place that symbolizes a time of peaceful coexistence in Yugoslavia. Senka Kurt is 24 years old at the time.
This hall was full. We were 2 meters away from the stage. The atmosphere was great. We were an exuberant crowd who wanted to make the most of life, as if we felt something bad was coming.
Thousands came from all over the country to the Olympic Hall this evening to send a signal.
It was always the heart of former Yugoslavia because we were always together. There were churches, mosques and synagogues here at the same time. It was important to tell Belgrade and Zagreb that we need peace. We're better than in Sarajevo.
Senka Kurt is the only one of her former friends who stayed in Sarajevo.
Some are sadly no longer alive, and others live all over, from Australia to America. This was probably the last time we were all together.
In early 1992, events pick up speed. In January, the Serb-populated areas in Bosnia-Herzegovina merge to form a Serbian republic, the Republika Srpska. On the 1st of March, Muslims and Croats vote for the independence of Bosnia-Herzegovina in a referendum. Hoping to prevent a major war, Europeans and Americans recognize the country as a sovereign state just a month later. For Radovan Karadzic, it becomes clear that he will split off the Serbian territories in Bosnia by force. Militarily, he has a clear advantage.
As Bosnia became independent and the Yugoslav People's Army ceased to exist, most of the resources of the army as had been in Bosnia and Herzegovina were left, and they were left to the Bosnian Serb army.
Almost overnight, Karadzic receives a powerful army, led by Ratko Mladic as commander-in-chief.
He'd become a hero defending Serbians in Croatia. By the time he was appointed to be commander of the Bosnian Serb army, he already had an established reputation and record.
The first battlefield is the city of Bijeljina. This is where war tactics are tested. As in Croatia, paramilitaries are an important part of Serbian warfare. They also use sexual violence as a weapon of war and systematically rape Muslim women. The Muslim Nusreta Sivac was fired as judge in 1992 and taken to a Serbian camp near her hometown, Prijedor.
The nights were an ordeal. During the day, prisoners were interrogated there. The rooms were full of blood. The floor was full of blood. The walls were full of blood. The instruments of torture were often left lying around.
As a young woman, she stays imprisoned in the Omarska camp for 3 months.
We had to do everything the guards commanded, and of course, do with them what they wanted. We never talked about it in the camp, never with each other. But our silence and our absence after the sexual abuse said it all.
Nusreta Sivac has fought to prosecute these crimes. It is estimated that more than 20,000 Bosnian women were raped at the time.
This is a process of destroying communities through a form of violence that does not come out of gun barrels, but is in other ways targeted directly at the people.
Even if Slobodan Milosevic always denies it, what happens in Bosnia happens with his consent.
U Bosni je građanski rat između tri zajednice. U Bosni ne ratuje ni Srbija, ni Crna Gora, ni Savezna Republika Jugoslavija. Ratuju međusobno te tri zajednice muslimani, Srbi i Hrvati. Ali mi nikad nismo bili ni gospodari, ni naredbodavci delu srpskog naroda koji živi u Bosni i Hercegovini.
In fact, Yugoslavia, what was left of it, supported the Bosnian Serbs in many ways. There were many officers and higher military officials who were still on Belgrade's payroll. For example, Ratko Mladic, the commander-in-chief, received his salary from Belgrade.
Hundreds of thousands flee the contested territories. almost 500,000 Bosnians flee to Germany alone in the first year of the war. Dalida Rakic also left her Bosnian homeland. Today, she lives in Munich.
Before the war broke out, I lived with my family in Teslic in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I lived there until I was 6 years old, and when I was 6, we fled to Germany.
Dalida's family boarded one of the many buses that shuttled refugees out of contested areas.
I remember my mother telling us, "You have to be very calm, very quiet, until we reach where we're going."
Serbian soldiers board the buses, seizing refugees. After many hours of driving, the family is safe.
When we first arrived in Germany, we stayed with my aunt. Actually, I felt relatively comfortable in this early period because I had my family there and I felt safe as a child.
By the end of the war, more than 2 million people flee the fighting in Bosnia.
Many were displaced within the Yugoslav region, within other Yugoslav states or within other parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Many, hundreds of thousands, went around the world, parts of Europe, parts of North America, looking for protection, looking for different and better lives.
Nusreta Sivac has returned to her hometown Prijedor after many years in exile. A city where Bosnian Serb soldiers are venerated as heroes and where Muslims are still not welcome.
To je bila čisto moja odluka.
It was my own decision, although there were big problems for all who returned. The Serbian government here does not want any returnees. Here people are still discriminated against because of their nationality. That is why we can say that this is now an ethnically pure area. What was not finished by crimes in the war has now been completed in peace.
In April 1992, Serbian fighters also target the capital, Sarajevo. Karadzic and Mladic want to drive all non-Serbs out of the city. From the surrounding mountains, they open fire on Sarajevo. Snipers shoot at everything that comes into their sights. The occupation of Sarajevo will last 3 years. At times, Ratko Mladic personally gives orders to the Serbian units. All this is happening in full view of the United Nations. UN soldiers secure Sarajevo airport, provide humanitarian aid in the city and the surrounding areas. The need keeps growing. There's no electricity, no water. Food and medicine are in short supply. The city is surrounded by Serbian troops. Only a narrow strip around the airport is controlled by the UN. The area behind it is under Bosnian army control. The Bosnians design a tunnel under the runway to supply the city center with essentials.
We were forced to run across the runway at night. It was about defending Sarajevo and Bosnia. As we ran across the runway, the Serbian army fired infantry weapons and grenades at us from here and over there. There were many casualties and wounded.
Nedjad Brankovic fights for the Bosnian army. As a qualified civil engineer, he designs the plans for the tunnel. The project is kept top secret. Neither the UN troops at the airport nor the Serbian opponents may know about it. The tunnel is dug from both sides at once. The workers are supposed to meet in the middle. A risky plan, but it's the fastest way. As they near the end, the plan threatens to collapse.
We heard voices from both sides. We heard the other side working, but could not join sides. The last 4 days to complete the tunnel were a real drama for all of us. We connected the tunnel on July 30th.
It's 760 meters long, a tunnel connecting two worlds. It becomes the lifeline for more than 300,000 people trapped in Sarajevo. Strategically, however, the outlook for Bosnian Muslims seems hopeless. Surrounded, militarily inferior, hardly any support comes from the United Nations.
No member state was willing to go into military action. A military operation would have put the lives of their soldiers at risk.
Instead, Islamist fighters from Afghanistan, Albania, Chechnya, and other countries come to Bosnia. The up to 6,000 mujahideen are soon infamous. They are accused of war crimes, such as murdering prisoners. The situation in Bosnia becomes increasingly confusing. The Republika Srpska already includes large areas in the north and east of the country. There is another front emerging in the west. Bosnian Croats suddenly turn against their own allies. Until then, Croats and Muslims were fighting together against the Serbs, an alliance of convenience that is now breaking up.
The Croats from Bosnia were in many ways seen as the most nationalist, the most extreme, and they often saw their capital as Zagreb and not Sarajevo. So what they wanted to do ultimately was to join with Croatia and have a Croatian state.
Croatian President Franjo Tudjman is involved in the intrigue. As soon as the war broke out in 1991, he met with Slobodan Milosevic to discuss the division of Bosnia.
His longer-term plan was to support the Bosnian Croats to build their own state and possibly connect this area, or even Bosnia-Herzegovina as a whole, to Croatia.
One of the main hubs of this new conflict is the city of Mostar. The Croats want to make Mostar the capital of a Bosnian Croat state and drive all Muslims out of the city. Zoran Laketa was born and raised in Mostar. He still remembers exactly how it all began, on the 8th of May, 1993.
This day was supposed to be one of the most beautiful. My buddy was getting married. He's a Croat, and he married a Bosnian woman.
Zoran wants to pick up his brother and his best friend on the east side of the river and take them to the wedding party. But the brother doesn't come. Zoran and his friend head back west alone.
Around 1 or 2 in the morning, when the wedding ended, we went back. We saw cars with soldiers, many special units. That was the worst moment of my life.
On this night, Mostar is split in two. Zoran is on one side, his brother on the other. He will never see him again. Croatian fighters occupy the west of the city. Bosnian Muslims hold the east, the old town. Zoran happens to be in Croatian territory and is forcibly recruited, even though he is Serbian. He has no choice and must fire on the part of the city where his brother and many friends live.
I was just thinking about survival and my little daughter. I never thought about shooting or killing my brother or a neighbor or anyone else I knew.
On the 8th of June, 1993, Zoran's brother dies from a Croatian grenade. The Bosnian Muslims in the old town of Mostar are cut off from the outside world. Their Croatian enemies are militarily superior and fight fiercely against their former allies. For months, Croatian commander Slobodan Praljak doesn't allow any aid convoys to pass. Muslim soldiers who had fought side by side with the Croats are locked up in camps.
Until then, it was relatively clear that the Serbs were the main war criminals and had started this war and were responsible for most of the ethnic cleansing. But after the war within the war broke out, the situation became extremely confusing.
The Croatian attacks don't spare the city's landmarks. The old Ottoman bridge held the city together for almost 500 years, until it is bombed by Croatian tanks on the 8th of November, 1993.
And what was it destroyed for? Because of those nationalists who didn't even allow me to go to my brother's funeral. Not even that.
So far, the United States have stayed out of the Yugoslav tragedy, but are increasingly criticizing the inability of Europeans to act. Only the newly elected Democrat Bill Clinton is ready to put an end to the war in the Balkans.
It was the realization in Washington that neither morally, nor politically, nor geostrategically could one afford a worsening military conflict in the Balkans.
And then there's the power of images. Numerous media reports about the suffering in Bosnia increase pressure on world leaders.
The scenes of violence, what was happening. You had the besieged citizens of Sarajevo, people going to get water and they would be killed, not being able to survive. And those pictures, the television, which played a huge role in determining public opinion at that point, made it impossible for not to intervene.
The Americans make a plan. The first step, Franjo Tudjman should stop supporting the Croatian fighters in Bosnia and go back to fighting alongside the Bosnian Muslims against the Serbs.
Tudjman had no interest in ending the war in Bosnia. He had dreamed of a Croatian state, a big, independent Croatian state. He was persuaded to do so with the promise of Western United States, military support, support for ending the Serb hold over Croatia, for making Croatia a functioning state.
Since 1991, a third of Croatia has been under Serbian control. With American support, a powerful Croatian army is successfully built.
Essentially ex-generals, ex-military people who would be deployed in Zagreb, who worked in the headquarters in Zagreb with the Croatian armed forces, and were able to help Croatia develop a strategic capability, a strategic level perspective on the region.
On the 25th of March, 1994, Croatian President Tudjman and Bosnian President Izetbegović signed a peace agreement in Washington. They agreed to form a common territory, a Croatian-Bosnian Federation.
Ending the war between the Muslims and the Croats was the first step to peace in Bosnia-Herzegovina, because otherwise the war would have gone on and on. That was a crucial step, and that's what made it possible to put real pressure on the Serbs.
But it will be years before the Balkans finally come to rest. Despite the Washington peace agreement, the murders continue. The greatest single tragedy is yet to come: the genocide of Srebrenica. It will cost more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys their lives.